prosecution. May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
May it please the court, Ms. Whalen. Members of the jury, they were stealing, they were lying, they were working together. When the defendant became a police officer, she swore an oath to uphold the law, to protect and serve. And right now in Midlands, that oath could not be more important for a narcotics detective. Every bag of drugs in the MCPD evidence locker is in there for a reason. Every gram of cocaine is an addiction that can't start. Every ounce of heroin is an overdose that can't happen. Every bag of fentanyl is a family that cannot be torn apart. When this defendant stole those drugs from that evidence locker, she became a criminal. Only she wasn't hiding behind a mask. She was hiding behind her oath. She was hiding behind her uniform. She was hiding behind the badge she wore on her chest. Because of that badge, she thought she could get away with it. Because of that badge, she thought no one was looking. Well, today, everybody's looking. The people of the state of Midlands have charged the defendant, Gene Riggs, with embezzlement of state property and falsification of government records. And I want to be really clear. Everyone here already agrees that this crime was committed. Everyone here agrees that Jay Murtaugh worked with a lab analyst named Casey Bartholomew to steal those drugs and falsify those records. The only question you have to answer today is whether or not between January and April of last year, the defendant aided and abetted that crime. We don't actually have to show the defendant was the one pocketing the drugs or writing in the false entries, just that she knew what was going on and that she helped. We've met that burden. We met it by asking you to focus on three simple facts. The defendant was stealing, the defendant was lying, the defendant was working together with Jay Murtaugh. So first, the defendant was stealing. You heard Officer Murtaugh today tell you exactly what was going on. There were three people involved in this drug operation. The defendant, Jay Murtaugh, and a lab technician named Casey Bartholomew. The defendant and Jay Murtaugh would go out and steal the drugs. Casey Bartholomew would skim the drugs to cover it up. And then the defendant would go out and sell the drugs. You heard him say they were doing it over and over and over again from 2016 all the way up until 2021. That's embezzlement of state property. Now, the defense came up here and tried to discredit his testimony. They pointed to his plea deal as if that plea deal were a reason to lie. Members of the jury, it is just the opposite. That plea deal is a reason to tell you the truth. Because what that plea deal says is that if Officer Murtaugh gives you anything less than the full, truthful account of what happened, that agreement gets ripped up, he goes back to prison, he serves his full sentence, and the United States government prosecutes him for perjury. But we won't just ask you to take Jay Murtaugh's word at face value. We brought you evidence that corroborated what he told you today. And that's point number two. The defendant was lying about the drugs they logged into evidence. Normally in cases like these, we have to look pretty hard for evidence of people lying. Today, some of the lies the defendant told are right on this piece of paper that you have in front of you. The evidence log. Let's look at one example. On February 12th, the defendant logged 24.1 grams of cocaine into evidence. Now, if this is right, when you went to the evidence locker, that's more or less what you'd expect to find. We call the DEA agent to the stand who did go back to the evidence locker. She tested those drugs, and she didn't find 24.1 grams of cocaine. No, 1/3 of that sample had been replaced with baking soda. And it wasn't just that sample. Every single time for 4 months that the defendant and Jay Murtaugh logged drugs into evidence, we've got the heroin on March 23rd, the heroin on March 11th, the heroin on March 13th. 1/3 was missing and replaced with baking soda. That's falsification of records. And because we know the defendant helped, the lab technician's lies are the defendant's lies too. And that's point number 3. The defendant, Jay Murtaugh, and that lab technician were working together. We call the witness to the stand, Courtney Rudd, who told you exactly that. She saw the defendant and Jay Murtaugh together in a nightclub, selling drugs, making money, doing it together. Now, I want to take a moment and discuss the defense's story. Because it's true, the defense doesn't have a burden in this case, but when they do tell you a story, when they do put on a case, you are allowed to ask yourself if it's reasonable, if it makes sense. Let me tell you, it doesn't. They got up here and told you, sure, there was a conspiracy. Sure, our client used drugs, was addicted to drugs in exactly the same time frame this skimming operation was going on. But she had no idea the drugs she was using were coming from the Midlands Police Department, that she didn't have. Members of the jury, when you evaluate that story in the jury room, I want you to remember what the defendant told us on cross-examination. When I asked her about why she offered the FBI a bribe, when they weren't asking about her addiction, when they were asking about drugs missing from evidence, she said, I wanted them to stop asking questions about the drugs so that they wouldn't find out. When I asked the defendant about her story, about the drugs she was using back in 2016, she admitted she lied to investigators, and not back in 2016. Investigators in this case after Jay Murtaugh had already been arrested. And the defense wants you to take the defendant at face value today. Members of the jury, it's not reason. It's not reasonable doubt. What makes this case so tragic isn't just the fact that the defendant and Jay Murtaugh were stealing or lying or working together. What makes this case so tragic is that this defendant and Jay Murtaugh didn't even think they were doing anything all that bad. You heard him say it today. They were stealing from criminals. They weren't hurting anyone, he said. And slowly but surely, this defendant and Jay Murtaugh became the exact type of criminal it was their very job to stop. They became drug dealers, and they were hurting people. Instead of protecting this community, they protected their pockets. Instead of serving the people of the state of Midlands, they served themselves. They were stealing, they were lying, they were working together. One of them has already admitted to it. The other is in your hands now. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you. Thank you, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you need to stand?
Yes, and exhibit form.
Sure.
No, it's fine. I'm just going to reason myself.
Do you mind facing?
That's perfect. Do you remember the first thing the state told you? They were stealing, lying, and working together. Now, since the first time we heard them say that, we've heard these attorneys repeat that phrase over and over. They can say it all they want, members of the jury, but that line doesn't prove anything. And it certainly doesn't prove that Miss Riggs lied to or stole from the police. Because one fact is clear. Miss Riggs didn't know where those drugs were coming from. But that's not to say we don't understand why the state is upset. Why they want justice for the two bad cops that decided to cheat the system, because we want that too. But there's no justice in sending an innocent woman to jail. That's why when the state walked through those doors today, the law placed a very heavy burden on their table. One that can't just be met by repeating the same line over and over. They have to prove to you that Miss Riggs knowingly falsified records and stole state property. And they have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. They failed to do that. And to show you why, I want you to remember two facts when you walk into that deliberation room. First, Miss Riggs didn't know anything was false about the evidence log. Now, the state has rested their entire case on this evidence log. You got to see it today. Mr. Dembski tried to tell you that this log was falsified because it says cocaine in the description of evidence. But members of the jury, he left out one very important word. It says presumptive cocaine. It says appears to be heroin, and the state's own expert told you that baking soda and those cutting agents look exactly like the drugs they're mixed in with. There's nothing false about that. But we agree with the state that the gross weight of these evidence logs, they've been falsified. But it's not enough to just prove they're false. They have to prove that Miss Riggs knew they were false. And the only way they could do that is with Officer Murtaugh. But I want you to remember why Officer Murtaugh is testifying today, and that reason is in my hands. It's his plea agreement. Mr. Dembski tried to tell you that a plea deal isn't a reason to lie. It's a reason to tell the truth. Members of the jury, Mr. Murtaugh could get his entire sentence revoked for just taking that stand today. He could get back to his family that he talked to you so much about. He lied to everyone in his life for 5 years. You don't think he could put on a show on that stand for 5 minutes? In fact, we actually know he told a lie today in court. And the state's own witness let us know that. Because Mr. Murtaugh told you that he never sold any drugs. Then Mr. Dembski just got up here and told you that Miss Rudd saw Mr. Murtaugh selling drugs. So which is it, members of the jury? Because one of them's lying and the state can't have it both ways. And either way, it's reasonable doubt. So with nowhere left to turn, the state tried to say that because Miss Riggs' name is on this evidence log, it means she must be involved. Then I ask you, members of the jury, where's the trial for Officer Park? Officer Allen, Officer Bowman, Officer Duran? There were 5 other officers on this log who are not in trial. And they never will be. Because the state knows that your name being on this evidence log isn't proof of anything. Their own expert agrees. Because she told you she didn't see anything wrong with Miss Riggs' numbers the first time she looked at this log. No, the only time she found something wrong was after her favorite student told her to take another look. This log doesn't prove their case at all. So that brings me to the second fact I want you to remember. Miss Riggs didn't know where the drugs were coming from. Now, the only 2 witnesses the state could bring to you today to try and prove that Miss Riggs was embezzling drugs from the state, that was Officer Murtaugh and Miss Rudd. We already know how much we can trust Officer Murtaugh, so let's talk about Miss Rudd. Miss Rudd, who got up here and told you, I want Miss Riggs to spend just as much time, if not more time, in prison than I did. Miss Rudd, who was arrested by Miss Riggs, of course she has every reason in the world to want to see her put away. That is reasonable doubt, members of the jury, and Miss Rudd cannot be trusted. Yet the state wants you to believe that it's our witness versus theirs. That's nowhere near the burden they have to meet today. Because it's not Miss Riggs versus any witness that takes this stand. No, it's any witness that takes this stand against all other plausible explanations. It's any witness that takes this stand beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you think it's reasonable that the state only called witnesses who are here to help themselves, then you cannot find her guilty. Members of the jury, today you got to meet Miss Riggs. We're not here to try and convince you that she's a perfect person. She's not. She's made some mistakes. But your verdict doesn't depend on whether or not you agree with every single decision she's ever made. Because members of the jury, it is your job to determine if Miss Riggs was involved in these crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. And I want to remind you that Miss Riggs didn't have to take that stand today. She didn't have to relive the hardest part of her life in front of a group of strangers, but she did. Because she wanted you to hear the truth from herself. The truth that her partner manipulated her from the very start of their relationship. Her partner saw someone struggling in recovery from addiction and decided to turn her into a constant flow of cash. And didn't care about the addict he made in the process. So when the state couldn't bring you facts that proved her guilt, they wanted you to presume. But the law says that the only thing we can presume about Miss Riggs is her innocence. Because when Miss Riggs walked through those doors, she was innocent until proven guilty. So when the state can't prove Miss Riggs knew anything was wrong on this evidence log, she's presumed innocent. When the state can only call unreliable witness after unreliable witness, she's presumed innocent. When the state cannot deny that Miss Riggs didn't know, she's not only presumed innocent, she is innocent. Find her not guilty. Thank you for your time.
No matter what time is it?
It is 9:15.
All right, can I give a 45-second rebuttal, Your Honor? Or do we
I
know
just-
that?
Well, if all laws is 9:17, you guys tell me.
All
I
right.
think he has 45 seconds.
Okay. All right.
May it please the court, Ms. Whalen just got up here and told you all of our witnesses are either lying or wrong. That instead you should believe that a woman who we know was addicted to drugs in the exact same time period we know this conspiracy to steal drugs took place, had no idea it was going on, despite the fact that she was police partners with Jay Murtaugh, despite the fact that she was working at the nightclub with Jay Murtaugh, despite the fact that every piece of evidence in this case points to her not. The cruel irony of Miss Riggs' addiction is that it fueled so many others. Hold her accountable for her actions. They were stealing, they were lying, they were working together. Find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, to avoid any all-loss issues, if everyone would please